Cuba, an island nation once known for its vibrant culture, stunning landscapes, and thriving tourism industry, is now facing an unprecedented crisis. With power plants on the verge of collapse, fuel shortages crippling the transportation system, and tourists fleeing due to safety concerns, the very fabric of Cuban society is under threat. Join me as we examine the root causes of this crisis and the potential consequences for Cuba, the United States, and the world. Cuba's electricity crisis is one of the most pressing issues right now. There have been widespread blackouts across the country, and these are primarily due to Cuba's outdated electricity infrastructure. Many of Cuba's power plants were built over 50 years ago, with an expected lifespan of just 25 to 30 years. However, due to a lack of proper maintenance and necessary investments, these plants have deteriorated over time. As a result, the country is now facing frequent and prolonged power outages, which are wreaking havoc on daily life and the economy. Another critical issue Cuba is facing is its reliance on oil imports, particularly from Venezuela, which has historically been a key supplier. However, in the period between January and November, Cuban oil imports from Venezuela fell by more than 44%. This is a massive blow for the Cuban economy, as the country simply doesn't have the financial resources to purchase oil on the open market. Cuba relies on oil supplied on credit or even for free from friendly nations like Venezuela, Russia, and Mexico. But this supply chain is increasingly unreliable. And on top of all this, Cuba is facing fuel shortages, which have led to long lines at gas stations and a ripple effect that is causing further disruptions. Fuel shortages are a major issue because Cuba's transportation system, especially public transit, heavily relies on fuel. The vast majority of people in Cuba depend on buses and taxis to get around, but these services can't run without fuel. This fuel crisis is adding another layer of difficulty to Cuba's already struggling tourism industry. Tourism has traditionally been a cornerstone of Cuba's economy, and in recent years it was beginning to recover after the severe hit it took from the COVID-19 pandemic. Before the pandemic, Cuba was attracting nearly 5 million international visitors annually. However, the pandemic caused a dramatic drop in tourism numbers, with only around 500,000 visitors in 2021. Thankfully, the numbers started to climb again in 2022, reaching about 1.5 million, and in 2023 it grew further to around 2.5 million, which was roughly the same level as in 2010. Despite the recovery, Cuba's tourism industry is still facing significant challenges. The number of visitors is much lower than pre-pandemic levels, and the recent crisis with electricity and fuel shortages is starting to take a toll. Tourism is crucial to Cuba's economy, contributing around 8% of its GDP in 2023. In 2024, tourism was projected to contribute closer to 9%. However, as we see from the latest data, the situation has worsened. From January to March of 2024, tourist numbers did see an increase, 4.3% in January, just under 12% in February, and 6.7% in March. But the months from April to October have been disastrous for Cuba's tourism. In April and May, tourist arrivals were down by 7% and 6% respectively. The decline accelerated dramatically in June and July, with a 13% drop in June and nearly 20% in July. By September and October, the fall was nearly 25%, with a drop of just under 21% in October. Looking at the countries sending tourists to Cuba, we see that Canada is by far the largest source of visitors, accounting for over 39% of all international tourists. Russia comes in second at around 8.5%, followed by the USA, Spain, Germany, Mexico, and France. However, this heavy reliance on Canadian tourists is problematic now because of the recent developments in Cuba. The Canadian government has issued a travel advisory, urging its citizens to exercise a high degree of caution when considering travel to Cuba. This warning comes at a particularly bad time for Cuba's tourism industry, as the winter months are traditionally the peak travel season for Canadians looking to escape the cold weather. To compound the issue, one of Canada's largest travel agencies, which has traditionally promoted holidays to Cuba, has removed 26 Cuban hotels from its list and is now recommending other destinations such as the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Honduras, and Colombia. This shift will likely cause a major drop in tourist arrivals, further straining the Cuban economy. So, what does this mean for Cuba? As we've seen, the country's economic situation is dire. Cuba is struggling to fix its energy infrastructure because it lacks the necessary funds and the parts it needs, many of which are subject to U.S. sanctions. Without enough money to repair its power plants, Cuba faces a continued cycle of blackouts, which disrupt the economy. On top of the energy problems, Cuba was also hit by two major hurricanes in the last few months, and the second largest city, Santiago, was affected by an earthquake. These natural disasters have added further stress to a country already struggling with its infrastructure. It's a classic example of when it rains, it pours, and Cuba is facing a severe crisis on multiple fronts. For tourism, the energy shortages and fuel crises are causing serious issues. Cuba's hotels, many of which were already in poor condition due to the economic struggles, are deteriorating further due to lack of maintenance. At the same time, the famous taxis and buses that tourists rely on are stuck in long lines at gas stations or simply aren't operating due to fuel shortages. The situation is made worse by the decline in Canadian tourists, who historically make up the bulk of Cuba's visitors. Canada's travel advisory has made many people reconsider their holiday plans, and the travel agency pulling its support from Cuban hotels will only exacerbate the issue. Without the influx of tourists, local businesses, including hotel workers and taxi drivers, will struggle to make ends meet, which will prevent them from maintaining their services, creating a vicious cycle of economic decline. In summary, the situation in Cuba is worsening. The country is grappling with severe energy shortages, outdated infrastructure, and the ongoing fuel crisis. Tourism, once a bright spot in the economy, is now in decline again, particularly as Canadian tourists are being discouraged from traveling. The country faces a grim future unless there's a major overhaul of its infrastructure and a resolution to the fuel shortages. However, given the financial constraints and the continuing effects of U.S. sanctions, Cuba's ability to recover remains uncertain. I hope you found this update useful and informative. The situation in Cuba is complex, but I will continue to monitor the developments closely and keep you informed.